The maintenance bay smelled like burnt insulation and old coffee. It always did. Ismail had worked the night shift at Helios Station for 11 years, and somewhere around year 3 he'd stopped noticing the smell. Now it was just the smell of the place, the same way rain has a smell and bread has a smell, and when he finally retired, if he ever retired, he suspected he would miss it in a way he couldn't quite put into words. He was under panel 7C with a wrench in one hand and a thermos wedged between his knees when the proximity alert went off. Not the gentle chime that meant a shuttle was docking, the loud one, the one they tested every third Thursday of the month, and which, in 11 years, Ismail had never heard go off for a real reason. He hit his head on the panel, getting out. Ow. He rubbed his temple, looked at the small smear of blood on his fingers, and then looked up at the bay's secondary display, which was cycling through a series of sensor readings that made no sense. Mass, approach vector, contacts plural, the counter still climbing. He blinked at it. He had very good eyes for a man his age, which was 47, and he was fairly certain that the counter had now passed 40. Control, he said, reaching for his comm. This is Maintenance Bay 4. I'm seeing some kind of mass on the outer sensor array. Can you confirm? We see it, said the controller's voice. Tight, clipped. The particular vocal register that meant someone was very scared and working very hard not to sound it. All personnel, this is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Unknown contacts on approach vector. Stand by for further instructions. Ismail stood very still for a moment. He had a wrench in his hand. He put it down carefully on top of panel 7C. Then he picked up his thermos, took a long, slow drink of his coffee. Cold by now, it was always cold by the time he got to it, and walked to the observation port to see what was coming. The things that came were not what anyone had prepared for. Not what the simulations had modeled. Not what the briefings on record described from the 3 previous contact events, all of which had been cautious and distant, and defined by long silences and longer negotiations. Probes sent forward, signals exchanged, the careful interspecies dance of 2 civilizations deciding whether the other was worth being afraid of. What came now came fast and came dark and did not send probes. The first ship appeared at the edge of Ismail's visible range like a bruise opening in the sky. A deep violet-black shape that moved with the kind of unhurried certainty that had nothing to do with capability and everything to do with the total, serene absence of concern. It was the movement of something that had never, in its entire existence, needed to hurry because hurrying implied the possibility of being stopped. And nothing, apparently, had ever stopped these things. Behind it came others, 14, 20, 30. He stopped counting because the display was struggling to render them all simultaneously. And because counting felt like something a person did when they still believed the number would matter. Control, Ismail said very quietly into his comm. How many? There was a pause. Then, too many, Ismail. Just stay at your station. We'll figure this out. He stayed at his station. He figured they wouldn't figure it out. He was right. The Selvan, that was what the linguists eventually called them, working backward from the sound the creatures made most often in their initial transmissions. A clicking liquid syllable that had no clean human analog, and that Ismail, when he later heard it up close, would think sounded exactly like the noise of a complex mechanism solving itself. Announced their intentions with characteristic efficiency. They broadcast on all frequencies simultaneously, a message that took Earth's best analysts 11 hours to partially decode. The core of it, stripped of what was probably layers of social or spiritual context, came to roughly this. You have what we need, we are taking it. Any resistance will be addressed. What they needed was the moon. Specifically, the moon's interior. A vast network of mineral deposits that the Selvan apparently used as the basis for their propulsion chemistry. There was a physicist 2 stations over from Ismail's Bay who had, within hours of the translation being circulated, coined the phrase atomic petrol in a message to a colleague. The phrase proliferated the way all dark humor does in dark times, rapidly, and with a kind of desperate affection. People said it in mess halls and briefing rooms and maintenance bays. It was the kind of joke that stops being funny very quickly, and then becomes funny again in a different, grimmer way, and then stops being funny at all. The Selvan did not ask. They rarely did anything that could be confused with asking. They moved into lunar orbit within 72 hours of first contact and began preliminary extraction surveys with the brisk, methodical efficiency of a crew that had done this before. Probably many times before, around many other worlds. Their equipment was already deployed. Their survey patterns suggested a timeline measured in weeks, not months. Earth's combined space forces, numbered, at that point, 4 active patrol vessels, 16 converted cargo haulers adapted for something that could theoretically be called combat, and a handful of orbital platforms that had been designed as communication relays and hastily reclassified as weapons platforms by people who were, in Ismail's assessment, optimists. Against a Selvan fleet of 40-plus ships, this was approximately the equivalent of arming yourself with a coffee spoon. It might express an intention. It would not produce a result. The Security Council met. They met for a long time. The first estimate was 6 hours, then 12. And by the time the counter hit 16, Ismail had stopped checking the updates and had gone back to what he'd been doing before the proximity alert, which was fixing the secondary coolant bypass on panel 7C. The bypass had been failing intermittently for 3 weeks. It would keep failing if nobody fixed it. He found, as he usually did, that having his hands busy helped him think. He thought about the dark shapes in lunar orbit. He thought about the sound of the controller's voice, that tight clipped register, the softening when she said his name, and about the message that had gone out on all frequencies simultaneously. He thought about what it meant that a species had bothered to learn how to broadcast on all human frequencies before they arrived. They had done their research. They had been watching, probably for a long time. They had come prepared. He thought about that for a while. Then he thought about something else. He finished the coolant bypass. He made more coffee. He went to find Dr. Rania Sharif. Sharif ran the station's xenolinguistics lab from a room that was technically a repurposed equipment closet. Because the station's architect had not anticipated anyone needing a xenolinguistics lab, and so had not built one, she had a coffee maker of her own, a significantly better one than Ismail's, an espresso machine from Earth that she treated with the same careful attention she gave her most complex translation problems, and several walls covered in printouts of the Selvan transmission, annotated in 3 different colors of marker. The layering of annotations was dense enough in places that the original text was barely visible beneath them. "I assume you're not here about a pipe," she said without turning around. "Coolant bypass," he said. "Panel 7C, it's done." He looked at the walls. "How are you doing?" "I haven't slept." She said it the way someone says the weather is nice, as a factual report about current conditions. 43 hours. I'm on my 4th espresso. "What do you want, Ismail?" "I want to know if they're talking." "They're not." Rania finally turned. She looked like 43 hours. Her eyes were sharp anyway. They always were, even when the rest of her was running on fumes. They made their statement. Now they're working. They don't see any reason to negotiate, because they don't think we have anything worth negotiating with. "Do we?" She looked at him steadily. It was the look she used on grant applications that were technically within the rules. "What do you think?" Ismail thought about the fleet in lunar orbit. He thought about 4 patrol vessels and 16 cargo haulers and optimistic reclassifications. "No," he said. "Probably not, but," she said, and turned back to the wall. He waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the more useful skills a maintenance technician could have. "But they bothered to transmit," she said. "That's something. Species that don't care at all don't transmit, they just take. The fact that they announce themselves means there's a component in their social structure, even if it's vestigial, even if it's purely ceremonial, that requires acknowledgement before action." She tapped one of the heavily annotated sections. "This section here. I've been working on it since hour 2. I think it's a waiting period, a formality, something along the lines of, 'We have told you, you have been told. What happens next is your fault, not ours.' How long is the waiting period?" "Best guess 48 hours, maybe 60. The syntax is ambiguous in a way that might be culturally significant or might just be a feature of the language." She paused. "It might also be 12 hours. I'm trying to narrow it down." Ismail nodded slowly. He looked at the wall. He looked at the heavy blue annotation around the section she'd tapped. "What happens," he said, "if we go to them during the waiting period?" Rania turned around fully, and the look she gave him now was different from the grant application look. This one was more careful. "What are you asking?" "They're in lunar orbit," Ismail said. "They're doing survey work. Preliminary extraction prep, according to the last intelligence update. They haven't shut down approach vectors. The warning beacons are still broadcasting, but the lanes are still technically open. And they haven't established an exclusion field around the moon." He paused. "Our shuttle bay is still active, Ismail." Her voice went careful in a specific way, not alarmed, because Rania Sharif didn't alarm easily, but deliberate. "The Security Council is handling." "The Security Council has been meeting for 16 hours, he said. "In my experience, When people meet for 16 hours about something, they've stopped handling it and started trying to find someone else to handle it. She looked at him. He looked at the wall, at the clicking, liquid syllable, rendered in Rania's careful notation, across 100 overlapping printouts. You said they require acknowledgement, he said, before action. It's a formality, but it's a real one. A structural one, yes, then someone should go acknowledge them. He said it simply, the same way he hit it about the coolant bypass. Not to negotiate. I'm not a diplomat. Just to acknowledge. To be there. To be someone going to them during the waiting period instead of waiting for the waiting period to end. She stared at him for a long moment. He had a thermos in one hand and a small dried smear of blood on his temple from the panel, and he looked exactly like what he was. A technician who had spent 11 years keeping a space station running and who was constitutionally incapable of sitting still when something needed doing. I'm going to, she said. I know, he said. You have to. I don't speak their language. Nobody speaks their language. You speak it more than anyone else does, he said. Which is the relevant comparison? She looked at him for another moment. Then she took the espresso machine and tucked it under the desk, her version of putting her out of office on. We'll need a shuttle, she said, Bay 2. Already requisitioned as a maintenance run to the outer beacon array. He paused. The outer beacon array that is technically in the general direction of lunar approach. That's a terrible cover story. It only needs to hold up long enough to get us out of the bay before anyone thinks to stop us. She was already reaching for her translation rig. Tablets. The portable array she'd been building for 3 years against the possibility that she'd one day need to transmit xenolinguistic approximations in real time from somewhere without a proper setup. She'd always told herself it was an academic exercise. The Security Council is going to be furious, she said. They'll get over it, Ismail said, or there will be larger problems than their feelings. She said nothing to that. She put on her jacket. The shuttle was a single-engine Oryx class, small enough that 2 people moving around in it produced an ongoing low-level comedy of bumped elbows and repositioned equipment bags. Rania had brought 3 tablets, the portable array, 2 reference databases, and a thermos of espresso. Ismail had brought tools. He always brought tools. Not because he'd thought them through specifically, but because tools were what you brought. You could improvise around a lot of problems in the universe if you had the right equipment and the willingness to improvise. The moon grew in the forward port as they crossed the halfway mark. Up close, the Selvan ships were more unsettling than they appeared on the sensor display. They absorbed light rather than reflecting it, which gave them a slightly unreal quality. Less like objects in space and more like holes in space that had been shaped like ships. Each one was roughly twice the length of Helios Station, and moved with a calm that was not stillness, exactly, but more like the absence of any consciousness of urgency. They had been moving for a long time. They would keep moving for a long time. This stop for them was a pause in something much longer. They've noticed us, Rania said. Her sensor array was running quietly beside her. 2 of the outer ships have adjusted their orientation. Targeting us? Can't tell. I can't distinguish their weapon systems from their non-weapon systems. The energy signatures are similar enough to be the same technology in different configurations. What does that mean for us statistically? She considered this with genuine seriousness. It means we should transmit. He opened the comms array. Rania leaned forward, took a breath and began speaking, not in any human language, but in the phonetic reconstruction she'd been building for 43 hours. The closest approximation she could produce of the Selvan transmission's most repeated sequences. The ones she believed functioned as something between greeting and declaration. The ones she'd practiced against the printouts on her walls until she could produce them without the hesitations that, in human body language, would read as uncertainty. Silence followed. Not the flat silence of a dead channel. The textured silence of a channel that is open and receiving and considering what it has received. Ismail ate half a protein bar. He put the other half back. He watched the 2 outer ships, then the channel answered. What came back was not exactly speech in any sense he could categorize. It was closer to the original transmission, layered, clicking, liquid, but with variations running through it that his ear couldn't parse but that Rania's tablet immediately began breaking down, phoneme by phoneme, symbol by symbol, building a secondary analysis alongside the primary translation attempt. They're responding, she said. Her voice was very level. I know. They're asking. She frowned at the output. I think they're asking who sent us, or what rank we hold. The syntactical structure doesn't make a clean distinction. Tell them we sent ourselves, Ismail said. That's going to translate poorly. Tell them anyway, she transmitted. The response came faster. That. She paused. She was quiet for a moment, reading the output carefully, reading it again. I think they find that funny. There's a repeated element in the response that shows up in the original transmission, in places that seem to function as sides. Anthropological notes. Things they've observed and find interesting in a detached sort of way. They think we're curiosity. They might think we're stupid, she said. Those often look the same from the outside. Yes, Ismail said. Can you ask for a meeting, direct contact? Whatever passes for face-to-face with them. Rania looked at him. We don't know what they breathe. I know. We don't know if direct approach is a sign of respect or an act of aggression. I know. We don't know if they have a concept of individual negotiation, or if this kind of approach would even map onto any decision structure they operate within. I know all of that, he said. He was looking at the ships. Ask anyway, she asked. What came back this time was different, not the quick, decisive response of a simple query, but something that had a texture to it, a weight, like a conversation being had in another room, the shape of it audible without the words. Rania's sensors picked up a low-frequency signal cycling between three of the nearest ships. She watched the pattern and said nothing, and Ismail watched the ships and said nothing, and they sat together in the small shuttle, in the vast silence of the approach corridor, and waited. Then one of the ships changed. The section of hull that opened was circular and smooth, a seam appearing in what had looked like a seamless surface. It opened slowly, not dramatically. There was no light from within, no visible welcoming gesture. It simply opened, the way a door opens, the way a question opens. Here is an entry. What you do with it is your business. Invitation or weapon, Ismail said. The geometry is wrong for a weapon. Then we go in. He flew the shuttle through manually, which was not the recommended protocol for any interaction with an unknown vessel. But the recommended protocol had been written before unknown vessels were a real category. And anyway, Ismail was a better manual pilot than his personnel file would suggest, for reasons he'd never elaborated on and Rania had never asked about. The interior of the ship was large and dark and smelled like ozone and something else. Something organic, something that existed in no catalog of known compounds, but that registered at a pre-linguistic level, the level that wakes you from sleep or makes you stop on a street for a reason you can't articulate. The aperture closed behind them. Gravity, or something that performed gravity's function with slightly different physics, settled onto the shuttle gently. Lights grew from no visible source, gradual, as if the room itself was deciding how much it wanted to show. Three of the Selvin came to meet them. They were tall. That was the first thing. Ismail, who was not a short man, was the shortest thing in the room by an uncomfortable margin. They were bilaterally symmetrical in the broadest sense. 2 limbs for locomotion, 2 for manipulation, an upright posture, a distinct head region. But the similarity to human body architecture ended there in the way that the similarity between a river and a highway ends when you look closely. Their skin, if it was skin, moved in slow organic patterns beneath the surface, like text scrolling on a display that hasn't been switched off. Their faces had structures where eyes might be expected, but those structures didn't behave like eyes. They tracked differently, the way sonar tracks. When all three of them oriented toward Ismail and Rania at once, the sensation was like standing at the center of a sound. Rania was transmitting before she'd fully exited the shuttle. Ismail stood slightly behind her and to the left, which was where he'd learned to stand when someone else was doing the talking. Close enough to be present, far enough back that he wasn't in the frame, as it were. He watched the 3 Selvan receive her transmission. He watched the lead one produce its response, not from a structure he'd have expected to be a mouth, but from a second structure lower and more centered, a biological transceiver of some kind that the sound came out of in a way that was felt as much as heard, a vibration that started in his solar plexus. They want to know our purpose, Rania said quietly, without looking away from the translation output. Tell them we came to see them, Ismail said. Tell them we came because our leaders were meeting and we decided not to wait. She translated. The lead Selvan responded. The secondary structure near its upper chest shifted as it spoke. A movement that might have been emphasis or might have been purely mechanical. It's making a distinction, Rania said. And her voice was doing something he'd only heard it do once before, when she'd cracked the phonemic structure of a previously untranslated Minoan script in about 4 hours, and come to find him because she had to tell someone. It has a word, a specific word, for the distinction between those who hold authority and those who act. as categories, as recognized social roles. She looked up from her tablet for half a second, then looked back. I think we've just been classified. Which category? The ones who act. And I think. She paused, reading carefully. I think that's the category they consider worth speaking to. Ismail filed that away. He looked at the lead cell van, at the slow-scrolling surface of it, at the sonar structures it's on its face that were doing whatever they did when they tracked him. He looked back steadily. It was something he'd learned. Not from any training, but from 11 years of arriving in situations that had gone wrong, and needed someone who could look at the problem directly without flinching. Tell it, he said. That we know what they're looking for on the moon. That we understand they need the mineral deposits in the interior, and that we've been conducting our own research on those deposits, ongoing, for 8 years, and we've found something in the data that they may not have. Rania looked at him, not at her tablet. At him. Are you bluffing? I'm extrapolating, he said. From maintenance logs and yield projection anomalies in the Phase 2 survey data. Discrepancies nobody investigated properly because the project was deprioritized. It might be nothing. He paused. It might not be, that is, she said slowly, an extremely thin thread. Thinner threads have held weight, he said. Ask it, she transmitted. There was a longer pause. The three Selvin conferred. The vibration in an ischuslish shifted, dropped in frequency, became a kind of internal weather. Whatever they were saying to each other, they were saying it at length. Then the lead one spoke. It's asking, Rania said carefully, as if she were handling something that could break, if you would be willing to demonstrate. Yes, Ismail said. You said it might be nothing. I know what I said. Ismail, ask if we can go to the survey site, he said. To the lunar surface. With our instruments. She looked at him. He looked back at her. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, he counted, and then she asked. The escort consisted of 2 Selvin who appeared from a corridor that Ismail was fairly certain had not existed a moment before, emerging from the wall with the same unhurried quality as everything else about this species. Not appearing exactly, but manifesting, as if the space had made room for them, rather than them entering it. These 2 were configured slightly differently from the 3 in the reception bay. Shorter, or perhaps just arranged differently, like a different tool from the same workshop. They moved ahead without ceremony, and Ismail and Rania followed, and that was that. The secondary craft that took them to the lunar surface was smaller than the main ship, the way a key is smaller than a building. It descended in silence. Genuine silence, not the absence of mechanical noise, but the actual engineered absence of vibration. A quality of motion that felt more like falling with intention than flying. The lunar surface came up beneath them, in the gray-silver light of the near side. The Mare Imbrium basin spread flat and silver and ancient below. The survey site was immediately recognizable from their overhead passes but strange on the ground. The Selvan extraction equipment had no moving parts that Ismail could see, no drilling assemblies, no boring heads, nothing that corresponded to any mining machinery he'd encountered in 11 years of maintaining the systems that kept humans alive in space. It operated at a level he didn't have vocabulary for. Where it had passed over the regolith, the rock looked subtly different, not excavated, not processed, but somehow less old, as if the deep history of it was being peeled away layer by invisible layer. It was the most alien thing he'd seen since the ships. The ships had prepared him for this about as well as a picture of water prepares you for drowning. The 2 escorts brought them to the primary access point and stopped. They stood back. They waited. This was the moment the thread had to hold. Ismail crouched down. He opened his tool bag. He laid out the spectrometer, the capacitance probe, the coring drill, the signal detector, the small portable analysis unit he'd modified 3 years ago to handle both standard coolant assessment and mineral spectrography because the station budget hadn't extended to 2 separate devices. He laid them out on the lunar regolith with the practiced deliberateness of a man who was not going to let his hands shake. Because if his hands shook, then the thing that they'd come here for was over before it started. The anomalies in the Phase 2 yield projection data were real. He'd been running the math in the back of his mind since the shuttle bay, and every iteration came up the same. They were real and they were not small. A systematic deviation in the projected yield curves that suggested the survey data had been modeling the wrong extraction depth. Not wrong by much. Wrong in the way that a few degrees of compass error are not much until you're 40 miles out to sea. He ran the spectrometer across the primary deposit zone. He checked the reading. He adjusted the calibration, not because it needed it, because he'd calibrated it yesterday and his calibrations held, but because he needed another moment before he went to the next depth and ran it again. Then he moved to the sub-primary zone, the one below the Selvan's extraction floor, the one that wasn't in their survey data. The reading came back. He looked at it for a long time. "Rania," he said. His voice came out level. He was grateful for that. She came and crouched beside him. She looked at the spectrometer output. She read it. She read it again. The second time, she was cross-referencing against the chemical signature from the Selvan's own survey data. She'd pulled it off their transmitted data packets during the descent. An extraction so casual that the Selvan might not have noticed it, or might have allowed it, or might have been curious to see what she'd do with it. "Your spectrometer," she said. "When did you last calibrate it?" "Yesterday morning." "Yourself?" "Always myself." She was quiet for another moment. She stood up slowly. "The deposit layer the Selvan have been surveying is the surface expression," she said. "The skin of it. The concentrations they need are significantly deeper, and significantly," she stopped. She cleared her throat, "significantly larger, by at least an order of magnitude." Ismail stood up beside her. The two Selvan escorts had not moved. They were watching, or tracking, or whatever they did. The low-frequency vibration in Ismail's chest had started up again. Subtler this time, like the feeling just before a thunderstorm. "Tell them," Ismail said. Rania began transmitting. She spoke for a long time. She described the spectrographic readings, raw and analyzed both. She described the stratigraphic implications, what the sub-primary reading meant about the depth profile of the deposit, the volume projections at depth, the yield differential between what the Selvan had surveyed and what the actual extraction at the correct depth would produce. She described it in the Selvan's own notation as nearly as she could manage, using the terminology she'd extracted from their survey data, embedding it in the phonemic structure of their language like a key fitted to a lock. She spoke for 11 minutes. Ismail timed it without looking at his watch, because he'd learned to hold time in his body from years of estimating repair windows in situations where checking a watch would mean putting down a tool. The escorts responded at length. The vibration in Ismail's chest shifted, frequency, duration, the quality of it, changed character. It became something he would not have been able to describe but that he recognized, in a way he didn't fully understand, as something like urgency not there. The feeling of standing on the right side of something. Then they transmitted upward. He watched it go, not visibly, not really, but Rania's instruments caught the burst transmission, and her expression caught the rest, and they waited. Ismail sat down on the lunar regolith cross-legged, because his knees were not as good as they'd been. At 36 and crouching was fine for equipment work, but not for sustained waiting. He poured the last of his coffee from his thermos. It was cold. He drank it anyway, the same way he always did, the same way he'd been drinking cold coffee in maintenance bays and repair corridors for 11 years. The way that you drink a thing that's not ideal because the alternative is not having anything. "You should have told me you'd actually found something," Rania said. She sat down beside him. Not cross-legged, she had her tablet on her knee, still running analysis, which was her version of keeping her hands busy. "I didn't know I had until I looked," he said. "That is an extremely fine distinction." "Most useful distinctions are fine," he said. "The obvious ones don't need distinguishing." She said nothing for a moment. Above them, above the thin skin of the moon's non-atmosphere, above the slow arcs of orbital geometry, the Selvan fleet maintained its positions. 40-plus ships, each one a dark aperture in what humanity had always assumed was a quiet sky. They had come a very long way to take something. And somewhere up there, in a meeting between the ones who decided, the data Rania had transmitted was being assessed. The response came down from the fleet like weather. A burst transmission to the escort pair's receivers, parsed through their secondary communication structures, retransmitted to Rania's portable array. She read it twice before she looked up. "They want the complete data package," she said. "Every reading, the yield projections, the spectrographic full spectrum analysis, the stratigraphic modeling, and," she looked back at the tablet, "and our own geological survey records, lunar, cislunar, near-solar. Everything we've mapped. And in exchange," she took a breath, "in exchange for providing data that increases their extraction efficiency, their phrasing, not mine, they are prepared to formally recognize the prior claim of established inhabitants." She looked up. "That's the phrase. Prior claim. It's a legal term in their system. An actual codified concept. What does it mean practically? It means they'll extract from the deep deposits under negotiated access parameters. not claim exclusive extraction rights. It means the near surface and structural integrity of the moon are classified as protected under the prior claim status. She paused. And it means they want to initiate what translates roughly as a compact of reciprocal data. Ongoing. What do we get out of that? She looked at the tablet again. The look on her face was careful. The way a person is careful when they're trying not to let a thing that has just become real knock them over. Access to their propulsion chemistry, she said. Theoretical framework. Applied mathematics, the underlying physics. She looked up at him. Ismail. These ships have traveling for. The signal pattern analysis suggests at minimum 2 centuries of continuous transit. Probably more. He let that sit. 2 centuries, he said. At minimum. He looked up at the fleet. He thought about 2 centuries of movement through space. Of moving from star to star with the unhurried certainty of things that had figured out the equations. He thought about what those equations might make possible for a species that hadn't figured them out yet, but was constitutionally incapable of not wanting to. Tell them yes, he said. The Security Council is on its 18th hour of meeting by now, he said. Tell them yes, we'll handle ratification from our side. That's a paper problem. Paper problems have paper solutions, he looked at her. Tell them yes, Rania. She held his gaze. She had known him for 6 years, which was long enough to know that there was no point arguing with him when he had that particular quality of stillness in his voice. The stillness that wasn't calm exactly, but was something adjacent to it. The stillness of a person who has done the calculation and arrived somewhere and is now simply waiting for the universe to catch up. She lifted the transmission unit and spoke. The response came back in less than a minute, decisive. Complete. The kind of response that doesn't have second thoughts in it. The lead escort inclined its upper structure, not a bow, not exactly anything that had a human name, but something that lived in the same emotional territory as acknowledgement, as saying, this has been witnessed, and we have noted it, and it has been received. The war, such as it had almost been, ended in that moment. Or perhaps more precisely, it was redirected. Turned from the track it had been on, the track that led through 4 patrol vessels and 16 cargo haulers, and a great deal of human stubbornness that would have been meaningful and tragic and ultimately insufficient, onto a different track, one that nobody had plotted in advance. One that had only existed because a maintenance technician with cold coffee and calibrated instruments had gone to look at a problem, rather than waiting for someone else to look at it. They flew back in silence mostly. Rania was already working on the formal data package structure. Ismail flew the shuttle and thought about the compact of reciprocal data, about what that phrase meant for a species that had 2 centuries of theoretical physics that humanity didn't, and what it might eventually mean to have access to it. The Security Council was in fact furious. The disciplinary hearings were thorough and formally conducted, and resulted in a reprimand for both of them, which was filed and noted, and which, 47 days later, was quietly annotated with a joint commendation when the council had had time to read the full terms of what Ismail and Rania had arranged and understand what the alternative had looked like. The compact was ratified 91 days after they came home. Ismail went back to Panel 7C because the coolant bypass, as he'd expected, had not held through the stress of the crisis period and still needed fixing. He fixed it. He made coffee. He went back to his shift. He thought about the compact sometimes, in the maintenance bay, under the panels. He thought about the lead Selvan with its scrolling skin and its Sonshur structures, and the word they had for the category of the ones who act as distinct from the ones who decide. He wondered if they had a word for stubbornness specifically, or if that was too fine a distinction even for a language that had parsed it elsewhere. He thought about it the day Rania appeared in the doorway of Bay 4, 5 months after the compact was signed, with her expression doing that complicated thing that meant something had happened that required him to put down his wrench. The first data packet from the propulsion archive, she said. It came in this morning. He put down his wrench. The packet was dense and alien, and the physics team was going to spend years just building the vocabulary to read it. But at the bottom, tagged in a notation that Rania identified as something like a postscript or a gift, the Selvan equivalent of including something personal at the end of a formal document, was a different kind of data entirely. Star maps, their own. More than a century and a half of observation from the other side of the galaxy, rendered in a notation system the xenolinguistics team cracked in 9 days. Worlds, systems, routes between them, marked in the patient shorthand of people who had actually traveled them. The universe, it turned out, was significantly more populated than humanity had thought. And the cell van, in the postscript, in the aside, in the note, they'd appended to a formal data compact, had apparently decided that the species that sent 2 people in a small shuttle to sit on the moon and read a spectrometer during an active invasion was the kind of species that might use this information well. Ismail stood in front of the maps for a long time. He was not, as a rule, moved by abstractions. He preferred the concrete, the panel that needed fixing, the reading that needed verifying, the problem that needed someone to go and look at it. The abstract had always seemed to him like a place where people went when they didn't want to deal with what was actually in front of them. But he stood in front of those maps and felt something open up in his chest. Some room he hadn't known was there, some acreage of interior space that the universe had just gotten significantly larger to fill. He thought about ships that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, moving through those routes for centuries. He thought about what 2 centuries of travel implied about patience, about commitment, about the simple willingness to keep going. Rania, he said. Yeah, she said. She was already looking at the maps. She had been looking at them for an hour before she came to get him. That's a lot of places. It is. He was quiet for a moment. Something settled in him, the way a well-aligned component settles into place. Right, and solid, and pointing at something specific. I'm going to need a bigger thermos, he said. She laughed. The real laugh. Not the polite one or the professional one, but the one that came from somewhere genuine, the one that sounded like someone who had just discovered that the universe is, against considerable odds, worth the trouble of being in. He made a note to requisition a better shuttle. Then he went and fixed panel 7C. It would need fixing again eventually. Things always did. That was, in his experience, the point.